Hey everybody, and welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, welcome to the family. I'm Alicia, and today I'm going to be giving you a couple of recommendations for Latinx or Hispanic Heritage Month. I did try to include books from several different genres, so I'm really excited to talk about these books. I will go ahead and leave timestamps down in the description box in case you're only interested in one particular book. So without any further ado, let's get right into the video. I know this is a common trend here, but I have a really hard time talking about books that I really loved, and this is going to be one of those books, and it's going to be my first recommendation for you. This is actually a historical fiction, and it was the first historical fiction that I read in a very long time. I think it's been about, before I read this book, I think it had been about 2 years before I read historical fiction, because every time I picked one up, I just wasn't loving it as much as I thought I would, and this book made me fall back in love with historical fiction. I used to be someone that loved historical fiction set in World War II, but maybe that's why I am not picking them up anymore, because there's so many books out there about World War II, and even though I do enjoy that setting, I just wanted something refreshing. I wanted something a little bit different, and that's exactly what I found with my first recommendation, and this is Cantoras by Carolina de Robertis, and this is set in 1977 in Uruguay. So this is a time of a civic military dictatorship. So the 70s in general in Latin America are known as the dirty wars, and there's a lot of suppression against free will. There were student protesters that wanted more rights. In Uruguay specifically, you see the government stepping in and attacking the rights of people, and so there was a lot of fear going on in this era. A lot of people went missing in Uruguay, and they were either killed or jailed, so there was a lot of fear. You didn't even know who to trust, and this is significant because that is the backdrop to our story. And so specifically in Cantoras, we have 5 lesbian women who, from one way or another, end up meeting and becoming really good friends, and they are struggling to find themselves and an identity and something to hold on to amid this civic dictatorship that is going on in Uruguay. They're not only afraid as women to speak openly against the government here, they're also afraid as human beings because they do identify as queer and they could be killed. And so we follow these 5 women as they find this little sanctuary. It's this semi-uninhabited cape called Cabo Polonio. There are very little people that inhabit this little town that they find, and because of this, you don't really see the extension of the government and people living in fear, and so they end up gathering and pulling together all of their money and buying this little shack that they can call home. They visit it on the weekends, and it was just fantastic. The book was just so tender and heartwarming. All 5 of them are definitely morally great characters, but they are fantastic characters. They are so believable and they are so nuanced, and I just loved every single part of this book. But I think the thing that I love the most is how it ended on such a hopeful note, and it was something that I had been missing for a long time because I was reading pretty dark books around the time that I read Cantoras, and I'm just glad that I really picked it up. The next 2 books that I picked up are horror short stories, and they are both by Mariana Enriquez. The first one of those is The Dangers of Smoking in Bed. The second one is The Things We Lost in the Fire, and both of these are collections of short horror stories. I believe they both have 12 short stories. The one that I read most recently was actually The Things We Lost in the Fire, but my personal favorite was The Dangers of Smoking in Bed, which is her newer release. It's funny because I ended up reading The Things We Lost in the Fire in Spanish and The Dangers of Smoking in Bed in English, and for some reason I thought I would connect with the stories a lot more in Spanish, but it ended up being the other way around. And I don't know if it's because my Spanish is a little rusty, so I did have to have my phone next to me and look up some words, and maybe that brought me out of my reading and contributed me to reading this collection of short stories a lot slower. So I don't know if that was the reason for me enjoying it just a little bit less than The Dangers of Smoking in Bed, but overall I thought these were excellent. Both of these collections deal a lot with the human condition and just with human nature in general. They're also short stories that are very subtle. The horror is definitely implied and it is not like thrown into your face. Mariana Enriquez is someone who doesn't handhold you through her stories. She tells you a story and she lets you, the reader, figure out what you want to get from that. And if I'm being honest, some stories just went over my head. At the end of some of them, I was left with this feeling of like, okay, well, what was the point of that? And it frustrated me when I was reading them. But now, after weeks of digesting and thinking back, it just really makes me think back to these stories and what message she was trying to convey. So I thought they were brilliantly executed, and I think these are short stories that would really benefit from a reread once you actually get a hang of her writing and the way that she structures her stories. So if you're into horror and you like short stories, this is one I recommend you pick up. The next book on this list is one that I have touched on before. I can't remember if I've talked about it in a wrap-up or not, so I will just briefly touch on it. If I have talked about it before, I will go ahead and link the video in the cards and down below in case there's something that I forgot to mention, because I did read this book either really early in the year or even last year. I can't remember. But this is Little Eyes, and this is by Samantha Schweblin, and I have trouble categorizing this book. I believe it's like sci-fi speculative fiction with a dash of horror, and this book is structured in a very interesting way. So it is a book, it's a novel, but it's sort of structured as a collection of short stories with a common theme, if that makes sense. She does do a lot of experimental writing, which is something that I like to explore, and I just thought that the way that she constructed this novel was perfect for her intended message for the book. So one thing that I will point out about Little Eyes right off of the bat is that it is a very plotless novel, so it is more about the themes and about the message than it is about the characters or even the plot. So if you're a theme-driven reader, I think you would like this one. If you're a plot-driven reader, I don't think that this will be for you. So in Little Eyes, we are essentially living in this world where we have what she calls Kentuckys, and you can think of Kentuckys as Furbies with eyes as cameras, and they're not able to talk to you, but you're able to talk to them and they can hear you. And as humans, you can either be a keeper or a dweller. And so keepers are people who go out and buy these Kentuckys to have them in their home, and they kind of just like run around in your house and follow you and stuff like that. But if you're a dweller, you actually get to be inside of one of those Kentuckys, not literally but virtually. You're literally able to spy on someone's life and somewhere else in the world. And I know that sounds really creepy, and I had those same questions, like why would you want a random stranger to be able to see inside of your house and follow you around? And oh, you're not able to turn them off, only the dweller can turn off the Kentucky. This book really talks about human connection and human existence and experience. The next book on this list is by an author that just wowed me, and I did talk about her in my Latinx Heritage Month or Hispanic Heritage Month TBR video. This is Valeria Luiselli, and this is Tell Me How It Ends. So this is actually an essay, and it's very short. I can't remember how long it is, but you can definitely read it in one sitting. And this essay essentially shines light on to the experience of migrant children when they come into the United States and when they apply for asylum and what that process is like. You don't really get an insight into like the little technicalities, but you do get an insight into their unique experience and perspective. Valeria Luiselli was actually, and she still might be, I'm not actually sure if she still is, but she worked in the federal immigration system as a translator for these kids in order to be able to apply for asylum or refugee status. So Luiselli structures this essay as a series of questions, and it's the same questions that are posed to these kids who have gone through so much trauma and who have made a very long and very arduous journey, and who are then interrogated and then asked all of these difficult questions. And it's just so well written. Sorry, I need to drink some water. It's just so well written. Like, she's just an amazing writer. I absolutely fell in love with her writing style and the way she's just able to convey emotion and feelings, and just the way she structures things. I can't remember if I mentioned this already, but I didn't really learn much more about the ins and outs of the federal immigration system and how everything works, but I did gain more insights into the experience of being a child going through that system, which I found really interesting. And like I said, it's very short. You can read it in one sitting, and it's one that I really recommend. The next book on this list similarly is another nonfiction book, and this is The Undocumented Americans, and this is by Carla Cornejo Villavicencio. And this one was one that took a really long time for me to read, if I'm being honest, because it was just so difficult to read emotionally for me. Like, there was just certain paragraphs that I read and I would think about, and they would just make me extremely sad, and I would just sit down and cry. And so it was a heavy read for me in particular. What I love about this book too is that she throws in her own twisted humor. It's a little bit dark, so there's definitely parts of comedic relief within the book itself. Again, this is nonfiction, but it's a little bit difficult to describe. So it's part memoir. She does talk about her own journey as a dreamer and as an undocumented American, kind of navigating the school system. She talks about her successes. So she touches on her own journey, but it's also investigative journalism in a way, because she talks about stories and where she interviewed undocumented workers and in different sectors within the United States and what it was like to be them, and their struggles and their barriers. But she also highlighted different parts of their life that we're usually not privy to. And I just think that it's such a well-rounded way to approach someone who is undocumented, because oftentimes in the media we just see one side of it, right? But we tend to forget that people are people, and people suffer, and people have myriad of experiences. So I just really love this. She also incorporated parts of US history that we usually don't get from the lens of an undocumented worker or an immigrant. She talks about Flint. She talks about 9/11 and how a lot of the first responders were undocumented workers, but they never got a thank you. And now years later, they are suffering from all of these diseases, from all of the dust that went up in the air. So just highly, 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 highly recommend this one. It was one of my favorites. I loved it so much. The next two books are sort of in the same vein. They have a mystery, supernatural element, and they are set in urban settings, and that's why they have very similar takes. I do believe one is young adult and the other one is marketed as adult, but I just thought they were very fun and very adventurous. If you are a plot-driven reader, I think these are two that you will really, really enjoy, because as soon as I picked them up, I couldn't put them down because I just wanted to know what happened. And another thing that is similar about these two books is that they both feature folklore from different Latin American countries, which I find amazing. I love learning about folklore, so I did love these two. So the first one is 5 Midnights, and this is by Anne de Villa Cardinal, and this one is the one that is marketed as young adult. And in this one we follow El Cucuy, as they are known in Mexico, I believe, but this is set in Puerto Rico, and in Puerto Rico he is known, or it is known as El Cuco. So in this one we follow two main characters. It is a dual POV novel. Our first one is Lupe, and she is a Puerto Rican American who lives in Vermont, but she visits her family in Puerto Rico, and she really struggles with her identity because she often feels like she's not Puerto Rican enough, and people on the island definitely don't fail to point that out. She also feels like she doesn't speak Spanish well enough, and there's this whole identity layer that I really identified with. So she comes to visit her uncle, who happens to be the police chief, and on the day that she arrives there was a murder that happens, and she sort of gets involved in trying to figure out who is killing all of these kids and why everything is happening. Our other point of view is told from one of the kids who may potentially get murdered. His name is Javier Gutierrez, and he was a kid who struggled with drugs growing up, and he recently got clean and is turning his life around, and his friends are dying around him, so he's trying to figure out why his friends are dying. So eventually these two characters' paths do cross, and they come together to try to solve this mystery of what's happening. It was just a very adventurous, very fun book, and I enjoyed every part of it. Similarly to that, we have Certain Dark Things by Silvia Moreno Garcia, and this also has this supernatural sort of like urban feeling to it, and this one specifically talks about vampire lore, and you have so many different types of vampires with their own lore and like their different tribes and stuff, which I thought was really well incorporated into this. So this is an adult crime neo-noir, so it is going to be medium paced. It's not as fast paced as 5 Midnight. There are some lulls throughout, but that is because of the type of book that it is. This is also going to be multi-POV, and a lot of our characters are morally gray, which is something that I really love. I love morally gray characters. Certain Dark Things is also set in 1960s Mexico. All of Silvia Moreno Garcia's books are actually set in Mexico, and in this one we follow our two main characters. The first one, who is Atla, and I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, but she is a vampire who is descendant of an Aztec vampire clan. The clan has just been murdered by this rival narco vampire clan. She's trying to make her way down to the Guatemalan border in order to escape. She ends up meeting our other main character, Domingo, in Mexico City as she's making her way down. In this book, Mexico City has become this autonomous city-state. People know that vampires exist, and they're not allowed in Mexico City. And this is where she meets Domingo. He is this kid who is living on the streets and picks up garbage for a living to try to support himself. He ends up sort of becoming Atla's food source, one would say. There's also an animal companion in this. We do have 3 additional points of views, but I don't want to go more into that because I don't want to spoil the book. But again, very adventurous, very fun book, and I couldn't put it down once I got started. Since I'm already talking about Silvia Moreno Garcia, I just thought I'd go ahead and mention Velvet Was the Night. I actually already have a non-spoiler review for Velvet Was the Night, so I'll go ahead and link it up in the cards. It's very short if you want to go ahead and watch it. So that's it. Those were all of the books that I recommend for Latinx or Hispanic Heritage Month. Let me know down below if you've read any of these, and thank you if you provided recommendations in my last video. I took note of them and I will make sure to read them as soon as I can. But thank you so much for watching, and I will see you on the next one. Bye!